Picture a cold morning in the early spring of 1914. A foreman, covered in coal dust and damp earth, walks briskly into a telegraph office in a small valley town in the northeast. He does not speak to the clerk. He simply slides a handwritten message across the wooden counter, pays the exorbitant fee to have it routed on the priority wire, and walks back out into the freezing mud. That message is delivered hours later directly to the private office of one of the wealthiest industrial tycoons in American history. We do not have the original slip of paper, but according to the men who were on the site that day, the message contained only a few words. It told the tycoon to stop the supply trains, halt the masonry deliveries, and come to the site immediately because the steam shovels had hit something in the bedrock that was not rock. Usually, when a Gilded Age billionaire encountered an obstacle in the dirt, he simply bought enough dynamite to turn it into dust. But that is not what happened here. Within 24 hours of receiving that telegram, the tycoon arrived on a private train in the dead of night. By dawn, the entire immigrant digging crew had been fired and ordered off the mountain. By noon, a perimeter of armed private security agents had surrounded the excavation trench, and over the next 3 weeks, a specialized crew brought in from out of state poured thousands of tons of heavy Portland cement into the earth, creating a massive, windowless, solid block of concrete that served absolutely no logical architectural purpose. Today, the family trust that manages the decaying mansion insists that the concrete was simply a reinforcement for a natural sinkhole that threatened the foundation. But local legends, leaked newspaper testimonies, and modern ground-penetrating radar suggest something entirely different. They suggest that the tycoon did not fill a hole, he capped a tomb. We're going to look at what the official geological surveys say about the ground under that estate, at the indigenous oral history that warned about that specific hill long before European settlers ever saw it, at the original blueprints that vanished from the public record, and at the one piece of physical evidence that proves the official story is a physical impossibility. To understand the sheer scale of this cover-up, you first have to understand the world in which it happened, and the people who lived on that land long before the steam shovels arrived. The turn of the 20th century was an era of unprecedented, almost unimaginable wealth in America. The men who controlled the steel, the railroads, and the coal did not just want to be rich. They wanted to be perceived as a new global aristocracy. They built sprawling, monumental palaces that mimicked French chateaus and Italian villas, dropping them onto the rugged landscapes of the American Northeast to prove that they could conquer both nature and history. When they chose a site for a new mega mansion, they almost always chose the highest, most dominant ridge in the area. They wanted to look down on the world. And the specific hill chosen for this estate was the highest vantage point for 30 miles in any direction. But to the indigenous people of the region, that elevation was not a place to build a house. It was a place to leave alone. Long before the land was parceled and sold to wealthy industrialists, the local indigenous tribes maintained a very strict, highly detailed oral tradition about the geography of the river valley. We tend to view oral history through a modern lens, dismissing it as simple folklore or primitive superstition. But to people who lived off the land and navigated by its landmarks every single day, oral tradition was a practical, life-saving map. It was their science, their geology, and their historical record, passed down from elder to grandchild with rigorous precision. And their record regarding this specific high ridge was clear. They called it a place of hollow earth. The elders taught that if you stamped your feet heavily on the summit during the quiet of winter, you could hear a deep, unnatural echo ringing through the frost. But more importantly, the tradition stated that the hill was hollow because the old ones had left stones there. They did not claim to have built whatever was inside the hill themselves. The stories were very specific about this point. The structure belonged to a time before their own memory, built by people who worked with massive stones and then vanished. To the indigenous people, the ridge was essentially a graveyard of an unknown civilization, a boundary line that was respected and avoided. If you appreciate stories like this, where the history books quietly skipped over the most fascinating parts of our past, consider subscribing to the channel, because this is exactly the kind of mystery we live for. When the tycoon bought the land in 1912, he did not know about the indigenous oral tradition, and even if he had, he would not have cared. To a man of his stature, the past was irrelevant unless he could buy it and put it in a display case. He hired one of the most elite and expensive architectural firms in New York City to design a sprawling, multi-tiered palace. The blueprints were magnificent. They called for soaring towers, sprawling gardens, and most importantly, a massive subterranean network of deep cellars. In the era before modern refrigeration and electrical grids, a house of that size required enormous underground spaces for coal storage, root cellars, wine vaults, and complex steam boiler systems. The architects drew up plans for a sub-basement that would plunge 30 feet deep into the crest of the hill. They surveyed the land, tested the soil, and gave the green light for the excavation to begin. But they were about to find out that the indigenous elders had been telling the truth the entire time. Because when you dig 30 feet into a place where the earth is said to be hollow, you are eventually going to hit the ceiling of whatever is buried down there. And that brings us to the spring of 1914, when the digging finally stopped and the cover-up officially began. The excavation of the foundation was a monumental task in itself. In 1913 and early 1914, earth-moving technology was brute, loud, and incredibly labor-intensive. The Tycoon had hired hundreds of immigrant laborers, mostly Irish and Italian men, who worked 12-hour shifts for a few dollars a day. They used early steam-powered shovels that belched black coal smoke into the pristine valley air, dragging massive iron teeth through the glacial till and topsoil. For the first 20 feet, the digging went exactly according to the architectural plan. They cleared thousands of cubic yards of dirt, hauling it away on narrow-gauge rail carts. But as they pushed deeper, approaching the 30-foot mark to carve out the space for the lowest boiler rooms, the nature of the ground changed. According to a leaked account that we will examine closely in a moment, it happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March. One of the steam shovels dropped its heavy iron bucket into the floor of the trench and attempted to drag it backward to scoop the earth. Instead of biting into the soil, the iron teeth struck something so unyielding that the heavy steel cable snapped and the shovel jolted violently upward. The operator assumed they had struck a massive glacial erratic, a natural boulder left behind by the Ice Age. The foreman ordered a crew of men into the deep trench with iron digging bars and shovels to clear the dirt around the rock so they could plant dynamite and blast it into manageable pieces. The men spent an hour clearing the dark, compacted earth, but what they exposed was not a rounded glacial boulder. It was a perfectly flat, sharply angled face of dark stone. Confused, the foreman ordered them to keep clearing laterally. The men followed the edge of the stone, brushing away the centuries of packed dirt. They found a seam. It was a joint where the first stone met a second stone. The seam was so impossibly tight that the men could not slide the edge of a steel trowel between the two blocks. They kept digging, moving faster now, driven by a growing sense of disbelief. They uncovered a third stone, and then a fourth. This was not a natural rock formation. It was a wall. And as they cleared the dirt downward, following the face of the wall, they realized the stones were not simple rectangles. They were cut into complex, multi-angled geometric shapes that locked into one another like a massive, three-dimensional puzzle. It was a style of construction known as polygonal masonry. If you have ever seen photographs of the ancient ruins in Peru or the massive megalithic walls of early antiquity, you know exactly what this looks like. It is a building technique designed to withstand massive seismic activity, requiring an astonishing level of engineering, mathematics, and raw physical labor to execute. And yet, here it was, buried 30 feet deep beneath a mountain in the American Northeast, in a place where conventional history dictates that no civilization capable of such monumental stone architecture had ever existed. The foreman climbed down into the trench. He stood in the cold shadow of the excavation, running his hands over the perfectly smooth, mortarless joints of the ancient wall. He realized instantly that the architectural plans for the mansion were now completely compromised. But more than that, he realized he was standing in front of something that defied everything he knew about the world. He ordered every man out of the trench. He told the steam shovel operators to shut down the boilers. He walked out of the site, went straight to the telegraph office, and sent the message to the Tycoon. What happened next did not just confirm that the discovery was real. It proved that the Tycoon recognized exactly how dangerous this finding was to his own interests. When the industrialist arrived on his private train, he did not bring historians. He did not bring archaeologists from the nearby universities. He brought lawyers, and he brought a detachment of Pinkerton guards. The Pinkertons were a private security agency, notorious in that era for violently breaking strikes and enforcing the will of the wealthy elite with unquestioning brutality. The entire immigrant digging crew was assembled. They were handed their final paychecks, plus a significant bonus, and they were told in very plain language that if they ever spoke about what they had dug up in the trench, they would face severe legal and physical consequences. They were escorted off the property and placed on trains out of the county. The site was locked down. For the next 3 weeks, no local resident was allowed within a mile of the ridge. The Tycoon then brought in a completely new crew of laborers from out of state. According to local rumors at the time, these men purposely did not speak English, ensuring they could not easily communicate with anyone in the nearby towns. This new crew was not hired to excavate. They were hired to mix and pour concrete. And this is where the paper trail becomes incredibly damning. We can look at the surviving archives of the elite architectural firm that designed the mansion. The original blueprints are a masterpiece of logical, efficient design, showing the deep boiler rooms and the wine cellars laid out in perfect symmetry. But there is a second set of blueprints, dated late April 1914. In these revised plans, the lowest level of the sub-basement has been completely erased. In its place, the architects have drawn a massive, monolithic block of solid concrete, spanning the entire width of the central courtyard. The structural notes on the blueprint simply label this enormous feature as a reinforcing cap for a geological instability. There are no doors leading into it. There are no ventilation shafts. It is a blind, solid seal, pouring thousands of tons of heavy cement directly over the exact spot where the original digging crew found the polygonal wall. The official explanation was simple, and for a long time, historians and biographers accepted it without question. But when you begin to pull at the threads of that explanation, the entire story falls apart, leaving us with a mystery that is far harder to explain away. Today, if you contact the family trust that maintains the estate as a private historical site, they will give you a very polite, well-rehearsed answer about the concrete anomaly in the basement. They state that during the initial excavation in 1914, the engineers discovered a massive, unstable sinkhole in the bedrock. They claim that the natural limestone beneath the ridge had dissolved over thousands of years, creating a subterranean cavern that threatened to collapse under the immense weight of the planned mansion. Therefore, the Tycoon had no choice but to halt construction, fire the crew to prevent panic about the safety of the site, and spend a fortune pouring a concrete cap to bridge the gap and stabilize the earth. It sounds entirely reasonable. Sinkholes are a real engineering hazard, and pouring concrete to fill them is a standard, if expensive, practice. If you only look at the official architectural notes, the story seems neatly resolved. But history is not only found in official notes. History is found in the margins, in the quiet details that the authorities forgot to erase. And the first detail that breaks the official story lies in the very earth itself. I want you to look at the Regional Geological Survey from 1902, conducted 12 years before the Tycoon even bought the land. The federal geologists mapped the bedrock of that entire river valley with meticulous care. The ridge where the mansion sits is not made of limestone. It is composed of dense, ancient granite and metamorphic schist. For a sinkhole to form, you need water slowly dissolving soft, porous rock like limestone or dolomite over millennia. You cannot have a natural water-formed sinkhole in solid granite. The geology of the ridge makes the official explanation a literal, physical impossibility. The earth there does not dissolve. Whatever the steam shovels hit, and whatever the Tycoon poured his concrete over, it was not a natural cavern. So if the geological record proves the family trust is lying, we have to ask what really happened. And for that, we have to look outside the official archives, to a piece of evidence that was printed once and then heavily suppressed. In June of 1915, more than a year after the excavation was sealed, a small, independent newspaper in a neighboring county printed a short article on its 4th page. The journalist had interviewed a man sitting in a local tavern. The man was one of the Irish laborers who had been fired from the digging crew the previous spring. The newspaper framed the story as a tall tale from a disgruntled, drunken former employee, probably to protect themselves from the Tycoon's lawyers. But if you read the actual quotes from the laborer, the details he provides are chillingly specific. He does not talk about a sinkhole, and he does not talk about a natural cave. He describes a buried courtyard, He explicitly mentions the dark stone, the massive blocks, and the sheer, unnatural angles of the walls. He says that after the foreman ordered them to stop digging, he sneaked back to the edge of the trench and looked down. He claimed to have seen a set of massive stone stairs leading downward into the earth, disappearing into the dark soil. And he mentioned one specific architectural detail that makes his testimony impossible to dismiss. The laborer told the journalist that the stones were not stacked in straight horizontal rows like a standard brick wall. He said they were cut in strange, irregular shapes that fit together perfectly without any cement or mortar holding them in place. Ask yourself why that detail matters. In 1914, an uneducated immigrant laborer whose entire life consisted of digging ditches in the American Northeast would have absolutely no frame of reference for polygonal masonry. He had not traveled to the Andes to see the ruins of the Inca. He had not read archaeological journals about the megaliths of the Mediterranean. His entire understanding of stone construction would have been based on standard, mortar-based masonry. If he were simply making up a story about finding a buried building, he would have described a normal wall. He would have described regular blocks and mortar. The only way he could describe the highly specific, complex visual appearance of a polygonal megalithic wall is if he actually stood on the edge of that trench and looked at one with his own eyes. This is the moment the whole case turns, because if that laborer was telling the truth, then the official explanation is not just a polite fiction used to cover up an engineering mistake. It is an active, deliberate cover-up of a world-shattering archaeological discovery. Of course, the skeptics argue that even if the man saw a wall, it could have been a forgotten colonial root cellar or an early settler's foundation that had simply been buried by a landslide. But we have to weigh that against the physical reality of the site. A colonial root cellar is dug a few feet deep using rough fieldstones. It is not built 30 feet deep in the glacial till using massive blocks of precisely engineered stone. Furthermore, a colonial cellar does not terrify a Gilded Age billionaire into firing his entire crew, hiring armed mercenaries, and revising his entire architectural plan at a staggering financial cost. You do not pour thousands of tons of concrete over a colonial basement. You just pull the stones out and keep digging. The extreme reaction of the Tycoon, the sheer volume of concrete used to seal the site, the absolute secrecy enforced by the Pinkertons, and the blatant lie about the granite sinkhole all point to one unavoidable conclusion. The Tycoon knew exactly what he was looking at, and he knew that if the world found out about it, he would lose control of his mountain. Which brings us to the final question, the one that ties every piece of this mystery together. If an industrialist found a spectacular ancient ruin beneath his property, why wouldn't he brag about it? Why wouldn't he excavate it, claim ownership of it, and charge admission, or at least use it to bolster his own prestige? To answer that, we have to look at the specific laws of the era and the worldview of the men who ruled it. Everything now points in one direction. The indigenous legend warned of a monumental structure left by the old ones. The architecture plans prove a massive, sudden alteration to the basement. The geological record proves the official excuse was a lie, and the testimony of the fired laborer perfectly describes an ancient, megalithic building style that should not exist in North America. So here is what actually happened, not the polite story told by the family trust, and not a wild fantasy, but the only version of events that perfectly aligns with every single piece of evidence left behind. The steam shovels did not hit a natural void. They struck the upper perimeter of a massive pre-Columbian stone complex that had been buried by natural geological buildup over thousands of years. It was a structure built by a civilization that predated the local indigenous tribes, matching the oral traditions of the Hollow Earth and the Old Ones precisely. When the Tycoon arrived and looked down into the trench, he did not see a historical treasure. He saw a catastrophic threat to his property rights. In 1906, just 8 years before the excavation, the United States Congress had passed the Antiquities Act. This was a piece of legislation heavily championed by President Theodore Roosevelt, and it gave the federal government the unprecedented power to immediately seize any land containing historical, archaeological, or prehistoric ruins and declare it a protected national monument. The tycoons of the Gilded Age absolutely despised this law. To them, it was federal overreach, a tool used by the government to steal prime real estate from private citizens. If the Tycoon allowed archaeologists or journalists to see the polygonal walls at the bottom of his trench, the federal government would have descended on the ridge within weeks. The land would have been seized under eminent domain. His massive multi-million-dollar palace would have been cancelled, the blueprints scrapped, and his dream of ruling the valley from its highest peak would have been over. He would have lost the land, the view, and the narrative of absolute ownership. He didn't bury the ruins because he was afraid of a curse, and he didn't bury them because they were structurally unstable. He buried them because to a man of his immense wealth and arrogance, human history was simply an obstacle in the way of his wine cellar. He poured the concretes to create an impenetrable physical barrier, ensuring that no federal surveyor could ever prove what was down there. He entombed the ruins to protect his investment, and the legend and the laborer's report were never in conflict. They were describing the exact same physical reality from two different ends of a century, one as a traditional warning, the other as an accidental discovery. What connected them was real. We cannot prove every last detail of what the interior of that structure looked like because the concrete cap is still there, quietly holding up the decaying floors of the Tycoon's mansion. But of every explanation ever offered, the deliberate concealment of an archaeological site to evade the Antiquities Act is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for, and we do not have to rely solely on century-old documents to support this. In the late 1990s, a utility company was tasked with upgrading the subterranean water lines near the perimeter of the estate. The family trust refused them access to the main grounds, strictly enforcing the old property lines. But the utility crew had to ensure they would not hit any bedrock anomalies, so they ran a standard ground-penetrating radar sweep from the public road, angling the radar downward beneath the edge of the mansion's footprint. The raw data from that radar sweep was briefly analyzed before the trust filed a legal injunction to stop the work. The radar did not show the chaotic, jagged returns of a natural cave collapse. It showed the natural density of the granite bedrock, and then, extending deep beneath the concrete cap of the mansion, it registered massive, perfectly straight, right-angled voids. The lines were geometric, orderly, and entirely unnatural. The radar confirmed what the indigenous elders had always said: the hill is hollow. After everything, the ancient warnings, the snapped cables of the steam shovel, the fired workers, and the thousands of tons of silent concrete, it all comes down to this one quiet truth. The Tycoon did not destroy the ruins. The structure was far too massive to be broken apart by hand, and blasting it with dynamite would have destabilized the bedrock he needed for his own palace. He simply put a lid on it, which means the people we so often picture as primitive were right all along. They mapped the history of the earth with their voices, and their memory was far more accurate than the documented archives of a modern industrial empire. The ruins are still down there, perfectly preserved in the absolute dark, waiting beneath the foundation of a crumbling, Gilded Age mansion. But the answer to what is buried in the basement is not really where this story ends. Because what it tells us about ourselves and how we curate our own history is the part that lingers long after the facts fade. We like to think that history is an objective truth, written in stone, carefully preserved in museums and textbooks for the benefit of humanity. But this estate is physical proof that it does not always work that way. Sometimes, history is not written in stone. Sometimes, it is poured in concrete by those who have enough money to dictate what the rest of the world is allowed to see. Entire chapters of the human story, achievements that could change our understanding of what was possible in the ancient world, can be erased in a single week simply because they are inconvenient to the people in power. The industrialist believes that his wealth made him the pinnacle of civilization. He thought he was building a monument to his own legacy that would last forever. But time has a very specific sense of irony. Today, the mega mansion on the hill is slowly falling apart. The roof leaks, the masonry crumbles, and the family trust struggles to pay the maintenance bills on a house that no one truly wants to live in anymore. The Gilded Age is dead. But beneath all that decaying modern grandeur, the older stones remain. Everything you know about the past exists only because someone chose not to destroy it. And if you ever stand on a high ridge where the local legends tell you not to dig, maybe it is worth asking why before you decide that there is nothing there. An empire can rise and fall and still leave less behind than a single, perfectly cut stone hidden in the dark. Remember the telegraph we started with, the message sent on a cold morning in 1914? Think about it again now. It was not a report of an engineering failure. It was the moment the modern world collided with the ancient world and chose to close its eyes. So I want to ask you this. Do you think this is an isolated incident, or do you believe there are other major historical discoveries currently sitting buried under private property, hidden away just to protect the real estate? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and the conversations under these videos are half the reason I keep digging into these archives. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the stories that the official textbooks quietly skip over because they do not fit the established narrative, then make sure you subscribe to the channel. That is the only way you will catch the next investigation, and I promise you, there are stranger archives waiting to be opened. If this mystery kept you thinking all the way to the end, leaving a like genuinely helps more people find the video, and it is the reason channels like this can survive the algorithm. Thank you for staying with me all the way through the dark. Keep asking why the quiet places are so heavily guarded, and I will see you in the next one.